So I'm now going to work their mattress stitch seam, and this is the one, it's also known as ladder stitch, and it's a very popular seam with knitters. Most knitters will know how to do the ladder or mattress stitch. It's very easy on knitting because you've got horizontal bars between each of the stitches and you can count them and match them up, and the same when you turn it the other way, you've got the stitch heads there. Now as crocheters we've got the stitch heads which we can easily match up, but the sides are a little bit more tricky to match. So I'm going to start with the stitch heads while people get used to the stitch, and then I will work on the sides once we're more familiar with it. Let's have the stitch heads this way around. I think that would be easier, and then I can continue seaming around on the same side that I've worked in before. Now these pieces here, they've been used many times, so they're a little bit lumpy and bumpy. They've been washed and so on. It's quite handy just to have a couple of swatches just for working any stitch demonstrations or similar on. So I'm just going to secure this stitch here, and then we're going to look at how to do the mattress stitch or ladder stitch. I know both terms are used. I'm not sure if one is more popular in the UK and another in the US. I always try and use both when I mention that that's a good seam to use. So what we're going to do here is we're going to start by going under one crochet stitch. So this is a bit like working a back post stitch with your crochet hook, where you'd insert behind the stitch rather than through the stitch head. I'm going to cross over to the other side, and on the corresponding stitch we're going to do exactly the same. Insert our needle exactly as if we were working a back post stitch, and we'll cross over, and we're just going to repeat that until we get to the end. It's a little bit slower than the whip stitch, but now and then you might find that you prefer this technique. You can see why knitters like this. This looks very much like a knitting stitch. And so it's very easy for them to hide in their work. With crochet it's not as easy to hide. So this is one way of doing it. Another way is that you do alternate stitches, and I think this actually works better with crochet, although of course it's not such a secure seam. So we're going to go under this stitch head, and then we'll skip one on the other side and work under this stitch head. So instead of going back in here, we're going to go under this stitch head. So there are two ways of working it, and here you can see why it's called ladder stitch. It looks very much like the rungs of a ladder between the two vertical parts of a ladder. So again, we'll skip this one and work under this one. Still working under the stitches as if we were working a back post stitch, and again skip this one and go under this one. I'll tighten it all up at the end, but I just wanted to show you how the stitches look quite different when you're working them, so you can always be sure which one you're doing. I prefer this one for working crochet, but I can see that this one might be a little bit sturdier because you're working into more of the stitches. And then at the end I'm going to work through the stitch just to secure it at the corner so that I get a sharp corner there, and then hopefully I'm going to pull all of these to tighten them up on either end. And you'll see now, I'll loosen them up slightly as well. I think I've pulled them a little bit too tight there, that you've got perhaps a less invisible seam here, and what you do have on the other side is a ridge, so it can be used as a decorative seam if you want the seam to appear on the outside of a piece of work. I know that's been popular now and then in fashion. So that's the ladder stitch through the heads of the stitches, or around the heads of the stitches. You can see it's more invisible in the technique I've used at the top there than when I worked through two of the stitches, but it's flatter when I worked alternate stitches. So that's the mattress stitch. It's quite flexible, has a decent amount of stretch in it, so it could be one to choose there if you want that particular feature. So let's work on the sides now, and I will have to unpick this beforehand because I need the pieces lying flat facing me. But again, very, very easy to unpick, so continue working up in this direction. So again, I'll just secure the swatches at the same point. That threw a little bit too much. I wonder if I can get it back. Yeah, there's a little bit of the thread back. So I'm hoping that by having video clips of this, I'll be able to illustrate some of my patterns for people and show them the different techniques that they could use, or if there are particular techniques that I recommend for particular garments. So here we're going to be working under 2 threads of the same stitch. And again over here we'll work through 2 threads of the same stitch. It's important to work through 2 stitches, otherwise it ends up looking a little bit more like the whip stitch. And you can see we've got our horizontal there. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to work through a couple of threads, and this is on the head of the stitch, so I'm actually working on the same stitch where it joins the next stitch. You may work more than 1 stitch through each of your crochet stitches, and you may work sometimes 2 stitches, 1 stitch only for each of your crochet stitches. It doesn't really matter. You can kind of ignore where the crochet stitches start and finish, as long as you're picking up 2 threads each time. So here we go, that's 2 threads of that one in the corresponding place. And as long as, of course, as you have your start and end stitches matched. And it's easier to tell that with this kind of stitch because the work is lying flat, you're not actually holding it in your hand. It's quite easy when you're working a whip stitch seam on the side stitch to unmatch them, so you do really need a pin in there so that your hands don't move the fabric pieces and stretch one more than the other. The ladder in this and the sides of the stitches does not look as neat as the working around the heads of the stitches, but actually the finished seam usually does. So we can continue working that way, picking up 2 stitches on either side, and then again we'll be able to tighten that seam. Let's see where we can get 2 stitches from here. That one and that one, 2 threads from each stitch rather. Strands from there, and just coming into the final couple of stitches, I've got 2 strands from this side and 2 strands from that side, and of course normally I would secure it at this end too, and then I can pull them. I tend to pull on both ends really, and then straighten it out, so you can see that this is actually much less visible than the whip stitch seam in the sides of the stitches there, particularly once you've evened out the tension a little bit. And you can see the other side looks pretty much identical, in fact even less visible. Even in the bright orange yarn that I've used, you can only see that coming through in 1 or 2 places. So if you did that on a fluffier yarn and you had a matched yarn for seaming, you really wouldn't see the seam at all. It also disguises the fact that when you work these stitches, which are UK trebles or US double crochets, you get a kind of uneven edge, like a slight S shape in your edge, and when you pull these together it actually brings them nicely together. You don't really see where the seam is on the piece of work. So that would be a great one for working on your seam from, say, underarm to waistline, or down the side of a crocheted skirt or dress as well. It's a really good seam for your verticals.